the simulation hypothesis contends that reality is in fact a simulation, of which we, the simulants, are totally unaware. Some versions rely on the development of simulated reality, a fictional technology. The hypothesis has been a central plot device of many science fiction stories and films. Reception was better than expected in some modern theistic philosophical societies. For instance, origins, there is a long philosophical and scientific history to the underlying thesis that reality is an illusion. This skeptical hypothesis can be dated in as far back as ancient Greek philosophy. Simulation argument, in its current form, the simulation argument began in 2003 with the publication of a paper by Nick Bostrom. Bostrom considers that the argument goes beyond skepticism, claiming that we have interesting empirical reasons to believe that a certain disjunctive claim about the world is true, one of the disjunctive propositions being that we are almost certainly living in a simulation. Bostrom and other writers postulate there are empirical reasons why the simulation hypothesis might be valid. Bostrom's trilemma is formulated in temporal logic as follows. A technologically mature post-human civilization would have enormous computing power. Based on this empirical fact, the simulation argument shows that at least one of the following propositions is true: the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage is very close to zero. The fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running ancestor simulations is very close to zero. The fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. If is true, then we will almost certainly go extinct before reaching post-humanity. If is true, then there must be a strong convergence among the courses of advanced civilizations so that virtually none contains any relatively wealthy individuals who desire to run ancestor simulations and are free to do so. If is true, then we almost certainly live in a simulation. In the dark forest of our current ignorance, it seems sensible to apportion a neo-Euro unregistered trademark-s credence roughly evenly between and. Unless we're now living in a simulation, our descendants will almost certainly never run an ancestor simulation. Chalmers, in The Matrix as Metaphysics, agrees that this is not a skeptical hypothesis but rather a metaphysical hypothesis. Chalmers goes on to identify 3 separate hypotheses, which, when combined, gives what he terms the matrix hypothesis. The notion that reality is but a computer simulation, the creation hypothesis, that physical spacetime and its contents were created by beings outside physical spacetime. It is related to the omphalos hypothesis in theology. The computational hypothesis, that microphysical processes throughout spacetime are constituted by underlying computational processes, the Minder-Eurobody hypothesis, that mind is constituted by processes outside physical spacetime, and receives its perceptual inputs from and sends its outputs to processes in physical spacetime. Criticism equals, because this lemma is formulated in temporal logic, it should be analyzed according to a specific timeline, past and present. There is no proof of the existence of a simulation that would fulfill Bostrom's requirement that it seems completely realistic for it, mind to interact with. So according to this, currently the probability that someone was simulated is 0%. Future, scientific opinions about the future of realistic simulations are pessimistic, as Bostrom himself admits. The assumption of his main theorem is very far from being complete, that in short astronomical term Jupiter will not pull out Earth from the solar system or into the Sun. See, orbital resonance. Simulations are sometimes modified during their lifespan, but the physical constants are stable. Simulations are temporal, so the longer we live, the less likely it is that we are part of a simulation. A simulation that is undetectable by science would have to be very large and detailed. It would be very hard to justify its vast costs. Obvious way to compute how extra large would be the physical volume of computer memory required to try to simulate a unit volume of substance. Avogadro constant in comparison to the volume of computer's memory, is still very large. The most powerful supercomputer in the world has only circa 10-15 bytes of memory, compared with circa 6x1023 particles contained in only 12 grams of real-world unit matter. Gives microscopic massive matter that could be possible for trial simulation, and such supercomputers even nowadays still have the weight of hundreds of tons. The theory of a simulation undetectable by science is discouraged by the Occam's razor principle. Even one neuron isn't known well enough to simulate its chemical properties. Computationalism Computationalism claims that cognition is a form of computation, and underpins much of the work in artificial intelligence. It is related to functionalism, a philosophy of mind put forth by Hilary Putnam in 1960, inspired by the analogies between the mind and the theoretical Turing machines, which according to the Church-Turing thesis are capable of processing any given algorithm which is computable. Computationalism rests on two theses: computational sufficiency, that an appropriate computational structure suffices for the possession of mind, and computational explanation, that computation provides a framework for the explanation of cognitive processes. Computationalism assumes the possibility of strong AI, which would be required in order to establish even a theoretical possibility of a simulated reality. However, the relationship between cognition and phenomenal consciousness is disputed by Searle in an argument known as the Chinese room. Further critics have argued that it is possible that consciousness requires a substrate of real physics, and simulated people, while behaving appropriately, would be philosophical zombies. Types of reality simulation. Simulation of reality is currently a fictional technology, and non-fictional examples are limited to reality TV or computer simulations of specific events and situations. Current technology in the form of virtual, augmented or mixed reality is very limited in comparison to what would be needed to achieve a convincing simulation of reality. The following typology of the different forms of reality simulation is drawn from examples from both science fiction and futurology. One may usefully distinguish between two types of simulation. In an extrinsic simulation, the consciousness is external to the simulation, whereas in an intrinsic simulation the consciousness is entirely contained within it and has no presence in the external reality. Brain-computer interface In a brain-computer interface simulation, participants enter the simulation from outside, directly connecting their brain to the simulation computer, but normally keeping their physical form intact. The computer transfers sensory data to them and reads their desires and actions back. In this manner they interact with the simulated world and receive feedback from it. The participant may even receive adjustment in order to temporarily forget that they are inside a virtual realm, sometimes called passing through the veil, a term borrowed from Christianity, which describes the supposed passage of a soul from an earthly body to an afterlife. While inside this simulation, the participant can be represented by an avatar, which could look very different from the participant's actual appearance. The cyberpunk genre of fiction contains many examples of brain-computer interface simulated reality, most notably featured in the Matrix trilogy. Brain in a Vat, a variant of the brain-computer interface simulation is the brain in a vat. This is used in philosophy as part of thought experiments. Simulated individual in simulated reality assuming that a simulated human being could be conscious, an alternative to interfacing consciousness with a computer simulation would be to simulate both the human being and the surrounding reality. Consequences of living in a simulation. Based on the assumption that we are living in a simulation, philosophers have hypothesized about the nature of their creators. A conclusion reached by Peter S. Jenkins at York University argues that there would be multiple reasons to create a simulation. In order to avoid the simulation creating another simulation, the first would be deleted. As it is predicted that we'd have the technology to create simulations in the year 2050, long-term planning after that would be futile. This, in turn, raises questions as to why the creators of the simulation would delete the simulation. More importantly, if our universe were one of many being simulated, viz., as some of us, then the simulation argument could therefore be statistically applied to the creators saying they are in a simulation too. Testing the hypothesis physically. A method to test the hypothesis was proposed in 2012 in a joint paper by physicists Silas Ubin from the University of Bonn, and Zohar Davoudi and Martin J. Savage from the University of Washington, Seattle. Under the assumption of finite computational resources, the simulation of the universe would be performed by dividing the continuum spacetime into a discrete set of points. In analogy with the mini-simulations that lattice-gauge theorists run today to build up nuclei from the underlying theory of strong interactions, several observational consequences of a grid-like spacetime have been studied in their work. Among proposed signatures is an anisotropy in the distribution of ultra-high-energy cosmic rays, that, if observed, would be consistent with the simulation hypothesis according to these physicists. A multitude of physical observables must be explored before any such scenario could be accepted or rejected as a theory of nature. In a public discussion with Neil deGrasse Tyson, string theory physicist Dr. James Gates stated that he found self-correcting computer error code embedded within the fundamental structure of string theory, which made him question if was living in the Matrix. In popular culture, science fiction themes Science fiction has highlighted themes such as virtual reality, artificial intelligence and computer gaming for more than 20 years. One of the first references to simulations occurred in the 1959 novel Time Out of Joint by Philip K. Dick. In this, the central character is trapped in a bubble of 1950s small-town America. Simulacron 3 by Daniel F. Galloway tells the story of a virtual city developed as a computer simulation for market research purposes, in which the simulated inhabitants possess consciousness. All but one of the inhabitants are unaware of the true nature of their world. Permutation City by Greg Egan explores various philosophical aspects of artificial life and simulated consciousness. Other Egan novels, such as Diaspora and Child's Ladder, also involve simulated consciousness. In Ian Banks's The Algebraist, a simulist religion called the truth as the dominant belief system of a considerable proportion of interstellar humanity. In the 20th century, both drama and film have repeatedly explored alternative realities, such as the theater of the absurd, and cropping up unexpectedly in films such as It's a Wonderful Life, and the 1960s television series The Prisoner. The Truman Show was a fictional example showing the logical extension of this trend, in which the central character is trapped within a physical simulation and whose life is controlled by a director. The idea that reality might be a computer simulation was the central thesis of the Matrix trilogy. However, many earlier science fiction plotlines incorporated variants this theme and its associated elements such as artificial intelligence. Other feature films whose plotlines have explicitly involved this simulation hypothesis, World on a Wire, Dark City, The 13th Floor, X and Z, The Matrix, Source Code. The 2012 play World of Wires was partially inspired by the Bostrom essay. See also, Holographic Principle, Simulated Reality, Zeno's Paradoxes. References. Further reading, Are We Living in a Simulation? BBC Focus Magazine, March 2013, pages 43–45. Interview with physicist Silas Bean of the University of Bonn discussing a proposed test for simulated reality evidence. 3 pages, 3 photos, including one of Bean and a computer-generated scene from the film The Matrix. Publisher, Immediate Media Company, Bristol, UK. Do We Live in the Matrix? By Zerda Ameroli, Discover, December 2013, pages 24–25. Subtitle, Physicists have proposed tests to reveal whether we are part of a giant computer simulation. External links, Are you living in a computer simulation? Nick Bostrom's Simulation Argument webpage. Physicists say there may be a way to prove that we live in a computer simulation. Constraints on the universe as a numerical simulation.